What is going on, Chess YouTube? In today's video, Magnus Carlsen, he busts out a crazy rook sacrifice against the Indian superstar Arjun Erigaisi at the 2024 Speed Chess Championships. And here we go. In the game, Magnus opening 1, knight to f3, and Arjun does the same. Knight to f6 on the board. Then 2b3, the Nimzo-Larsen variation for Magnus. The idea, of course, being bishop b2, putting pressure on that long diagonal. And how is Arjun going to respond? Well, in the game, he starts d6, and he has a very interesting follow-up in mind. Here, bishop b2, and then e5 for Arjun. Arjun getting that dark square blockade on c7, d6, and e5, trying to hem in that bishop on b2 forever. All right, now Magnus, c4, expanding on the queen's side, and we do have a transposition back to a King's English after c4, e5 on the board, somehow, some way. All right, Arjun, bishop e7 on the board, knight c3, castles, and then g3. Magnus Carlsen is going for a double fianchetto setup in this game with bishops on b2 and g2. All right, now Arjun, in this position, the key idea for him is going to be c6. If he gets that move in, he will block in both bishops on b2 and g2 forever. Instead, he does go c5, and this turns out to be a little bit weaker in this position, and here Magnus is fighting for an opening advantage. All right, bishop g2, knight c6, castles, and then here Arjun Erigaisi, h6 on the board, taking control of that g5 square forever. However, it wasn't completely necessary. Now, Magnus Carlsen in this position, knight to e1 on the board. This is a very standard idea in this pawn structure. Here, Magnus may want to go knight e1, then c2, then e3, and then jump into the d5 square with either knight, the c knight or the e knight. That would be a very good idea, clamping down on that very weak d5 square in black's position. However, Arjun Erigaisi, he is ready, and here he just goes bishop e6, threatening d5. Now, if Magnus does go knight c2, d5 will be a very strong move. That pawn will be defended properly, and Arjun would actually have an advantage out of the opening. So instead here, Magnus Carlsen, he does not go knight c2. He sees all of this, and instead he jumps in with the knight to the d5 square. Knight d5 on the board, a very strong move. Of course, there were other ideas. For example, f4 expanding on the king side was also strong, threatening either e4 or even f5. But instead, knight d5 on the board, stopping the idea of d5 for black forever. All right, Arjun Erigaisi, queen d7, setting up bishop h3 ideas, a very solid idea. Now Magnus, he continues, knight c2, and he's almost ready to go knight to e3, supporting that knight on the d5 square. That would be a very strong knight if it was supported. Now here, Arjun, bishop h3 on the board, trading off those light squared bishops, a very good move. Now we have knight c to e3, then bishop takes, king takes, and then knight takes d5, and finally knight takes d5 as well. Now we are down to two minor pieces, the knights and the bishops. Now Magnus Carlsen does have the better knight, however Arjun does have the better bishop, as Magnus Carlsen's bishop on b2 is doing literally nothing in this position. So Arjun Erigaisi, he's starting to fight back. And here he does get an initiative going on the king side with the very strong move f5. And this is where the game really heats up. Here, Arjun Erigaisi is going to go for a kingside attack. Meanwhile, Magnus Carlsen will try to weather the storm and make use of his very strong knight on the d5 square. All right, Magnus, in this position, he does not like the idea of f4 or e4 on the next move. So with that in mind, here, Magnus, f4 is the move, gaining space for himself on the king side and blockading that f5 pawn once and for all. A very strong move, and it was engine approved. All right, Arjun Erigaisi, bishop f6 on the board, opposing that bishop on b2, a solid move. And now Magnus Carlsen, e3, bolstering his pawns in the center, and now he does have a very strange pawn triangle on the king side. You don't see that very often as white. All right, Arjun, rook f7, doubling rooks on the f-file, the idea being rook a to f8, potentially on the next move. Now Magnus, bishop c3, a sort of waiting move, and now rook a to f8 for Arjun. Now Magnus Carlsen, he has to find a way to slow down Arjun's pressure on the king side. How is he going to do it? Well, in the game, he jumps in with the queen to the h5 square. Queen to h5 on the board, menacing the king side with the queen. All right, Arjun, king to h7, then rook a to e1 for Magnus Carlsen. That being the other idea of queen to h5. It clears the queen off the back rank, setting up rook a to e1 ideas, and the rooks are in very good defensive formation. Now Arjun, g6, knocks back the queen. Where is the queen going to go? Well, before moving the queen, Magnus does take on f6. Knight takes f6 on the board, winning the bishop, and of course Arjun does take back. Rook takes, and then queen to f3, retreats the queen. There were other squares, f3, e2, and d1 were all roughly equal in terms of where the queen could go to. But now Arjun Erigaisi, he spots the fact that the queen can be attacked by the move e3, expanding in the center, and he plays it. e3 on the board, and here both sides are starting to feel the pressure. Arjun Erigaisi down to 22 seconds in this position. He spent a lot of time on that last move, and here Magnus, he continues busting out moves at lightning speed. He wants to win no matter what, even if it means Arjun Erigaisi running out of time on the clock. So queen d1 on the board for Magnus. Now rook to e6, centralizing the rook, and here Magnus does break in the center with the move d3. Now the threat is d takes e4 or potentially d4, depending on what Arjun does. Now here Arjun Erigaisi, he does not take. That would activate the queen on d3, so with that in mind, rook f to e8 is the move. But now Magnus, he doesn't take on e4, he actually pushes a second square to d4. Now the threat is potentially d5, forking both the rook and the knight on c6. Of course, Arjun is going to respond in the game. C takes d4 is the move, and now Magnus does take back with the bishop. Bishop takes, and then here Arjun Erigaisi, he has the option of taking on d4. Knight takes d4, getting rid of his knight for that bishop, but it turns out that would be a slightly weaker move, and instead here, Arjun, being the aggressive player that he is, he finds a way to counterattack in the center, instead playing the move d5, a very strong idea. Now Magnus, he does not open the center. C takes d5 would activate the queen on d5 after queen takes. Therefore, c5 is the move. Now Arjun Erigaisi, knight to b4, jumping in with the knight. The knight is going to infiltrate on the d3 square, and that knight will have the honorary title of octopus in this game. All right, rook to e2. Magnus Carlsen getting out of the way of that attack. Knight d3, hitting the rook, but now the octopus jumps into the d3 square. Knight d3 on the board. Just look at that knight by Arjun Erigaisi. All right, Magnus, a3 on the board, trapping the knight once and for all. Knight b4 is no longer possible. However, Magnus, he does not have a knight or a light squared bishop, or a pawn for that matter, to knock back that knight on d3, so it is going to be there for a while. All right, rook g8 on the board. Arjun eyeing the idea of g5, opening up the g file on the king side. He wants to attack, but Magnus Carlsen, b4 on the board. He knows he has the pawn majority on the queen side, the 3 versus 2 pawn majority. Therefore, his plan is to push those queen side pawns down the board as fast as he can. All right, Arjun, g5 on the board, continuing the attack. Now, the computer did like the idea of rook to a6 before going g5, putting pressure on that a pawn, but that is an engine move if I ever saw one. Instead, the human-looking move g5 on the board by Arjun Erigaisi. And now here Magnus, his best idea, believe it or not, is f takes g5, opening up the f file for his rook and trying to get counterplay on the king side. Instead, here he goes rook e to d2, and you know what this means? He is getting ready for that rook sacrifice on d3. So, g takes f4 for Arjun, and here Magnus, he does not bother with the move e takes f4, and g takes f4 is not a legal move as that rook pins the pawn on g3 to the king. Therefore, here in this position, the move, of course, is rook takes d3, giving up the rook for the knight and a pawn after e takes and then queen takes. So, e takes d3, then rook takes f4, winning the pawn on f4 first. That d3 pawn will fall as well sooner or later. Now, rook d4 for Arjun, threatening the rook trade. Now, rook takes e4 would not be a good idea. Then d takes e4, and that pawn on d3 would be defended by the pawn on e4. Therefore, rook to e3 is the move for Magnus. And now f4, Arjun Erigaisi, blowing open the king side at all costs. And believe it or not, this pawn cannot be taken. For example, e takes f4 would be met by rook to e2, the e file opening up, the e rook being very, very active. So instead here, Magnus Carlsen, queen takes d3 is the move, allowing f takes e3, and then bishop takes e3. The pawns being liquidated, and Magnus Carlsen here, he is down to 13 seconds on the clock versus the 7 seconds of Arjun. Can both players find a way to navigate the time pressure here in this position? Let's find out. All right, queen e6 on the board, piling up pressure on that bishop on e3. Now, bishop to f2. Keep in mind, Arjun Erigaisi, he has the 2 rooks versus the rook and minor piece of Magnus. Magnus did have to sacrifice the rook. Of course, he has 1 extra pawn here, but that is hardly enough compensation for the exchange. All right, rook g7 on the board, then b5 for Magnus Carlsen. Magnus once again pushing that pawn majority on the queen side down the board. Now Arjun, rook to f7, offering the rook trade, and Magnus does oblige. Rook takes, then queen takes, and it turns out this rook trade was not the best idea. And here Magnus Carlsen, as you can see by the eval bar on the left, he is starting to fight back in this game. And here he finds the strongest idea, c6, with the double attack on the b7 and the a7 pawn by the bishop on f2. Now Arjun, b takes c6, then b takes c6 on the board, and then queen to e6, increasing the pressure on that pawn on e6, but giving up a7 in the process if Magnus wants it. Now here, before bishop takes a7, Magnus does go c7. That is the strongest idea, threatening c8, roading to a new queen, and that would be game over on the spot if Arjun is not careful. All right, king g8 on the board, then queen b5 and rook to c4. Arjun Erigaisi piling up on that pawn, and Magnus Carlsen, of course, he does defend. Queen b8 hits the king, king f7, then queen takes a7, winning the pawn on a7 and defending the pawn on c7 with the queen. Now queen c8, simply blockading that c8 square. c8 promoting to a queen is now not a possibility, and rook takes c7 is being threatened. All right, Magnus, bishop b6 defends the pawn. That pawn cannot be taken. So now Magnus, king to e6, centralizing that king. Now queen to a5, increasing the pressure on that pawn on d5. Now we have queen d7, also defending the pawn, but then queen d1 hits the king, king f7, queen f2 check, king g6, then queen to e2. Both sides sharking around. Now there is a lot of pressure on that rook on c4, therefore d3, or d4, sorry, is not a possibility yet. Now queen c6 defends the rook, then queen d3 hits the king, king g7, bishop d4 hits the king once again, king g8, then bishop e5. Magnus simply moving his bishop to a much better diagonal from b6 to e5, where it still defends that pawn on c7. All right, d4 check hits the king and advances the pawn. And now Arjun is threatening rook to c3, putting more pressure on the queen. All right, king to h3, queen to e6 hits the king, king h4, and then rook to c3 as promised hits the queen, but gives up that d4 pawn in the process if Magnus wants it. Now here, Magnus Carlsen, he knows you cannot go queen takes d4, as then rook to c4 would win the queen. The queen would be pinned to the king on h4. Therefore, queen e4 is the move, not queen takes d4, queen e4 instead. Now Arjun, rook c4, all the same, once again threatening d3. Now Magnus, queen to a8, hits the king, getting out of the threat, king to f7, and then here in this position, Magnus Carlsen, he makes a big mistake. Queen d8 on the board. This move looks logical, but it turns out to be a very big mistake. Here, Arjun Erigaisi, he has the incredible move, rook to c2, threatening rook takes h2. That would be checkmate, as the king would literally have nowhere to go. The rook, the queen, and most importantly, the alpha 0 h-pawn deliver the checkmate. However, here instead, Arjun Erigaisi, he misses the idea. He just goes d3, pushing that pawn down the board. He has 2 seconds left on the clock, as does Magnus Carlsen. They're both relying on pure reflexes at this point. All right, Magnus, bishop f4 on the board, defends the bishop. Then queen f6, hitting the king and forcing those queens off the board if Arjun wants it. Now king to g4, and Arjun does not trade queens. Of course, queen takes d8 would be met by c takes d8, getting a new queen. That is not an option. So queen e6 hits the king, king to h4, and then queen to e7, once again offering the queen trade. And this time, again, Magnus, he declines. King to g4 on the board. Now rook takes c7, giving up the rook for that pawn. What is Arjun thinking? Well, let's find out. Here in this position, here Magnus Carlsen, if he takes the rook on c7, queen takes, then bishop takes, then the move, of course, is d2, and the king is outside the square of the pawn. The king cannot get to e2 in time, and therefore Arjun would get a new queen and win on the spot. Therefore, that rook on c7 is poisoned. Arjun wins a clean pawn, but so does Magnus. Queen takes d3 on the board, winning the other pawn, and we still have the queen and the rook versus the queen, bishop, and 2 extra pawns. This is anyone's game. Both sides have 2 to 4 seconds left on the clock. All right, queen d6 hits the king. Queen f5 blocks the attack with a check of his own, and now the queens do come off the board. Queen takes, king takes, then rook to c5. Arjun now has the rook versus the bishop and 2 pawns. Again, it is anyone's game here. All right, king to e4, rook c2, flying in with the rook, pressuring the pawn on h2. Now Magnus h4, expanding on the king side, but Arjun does the same, h5, blocking those h-pawns. Now bishop d6, Magnus Carlsen simply defending the pawn on a3 with the bishop and setting up bishop b4 ideas if needed. All right, king e6. Then bishop b4, as promised, that bishop and pawn defend each other forever. You cannot take either piece with the rook. Now rook f2, activating the rook on the f-file. King d4, rook f3, threatening rook takes g3, but now king to c5. Magnus Carlsen, he is not defending that pawn on g3. Instead, he is going for it on the queen side. And now the computer seems to think Arjun Erigaisi has enough for a win here. All right, rook takes g3, a4, pushing the pawn. King d7, Arjun trying to defend, but now a5 and then a6 for Magnus Carlsen. He's pushing the pawn down the board. Now king c7, trying to get to that a8 square. Of course, the bishop does not control a8. If Arjun gets his king there, that king will be there forever entombed on a8. All right, bishop a5 hits the king. King b8, the king is ready for king to a8. Now, bishop d8 for Magnus Carlsen, defending the pawn on h4. Arjun can no longer take on h4, and we're in some sort of weird stalemate position where neither side will be able to make progress. All right, king a7, bishop g5, defends the pawn. King takes a6, and Arjun, he still has winning chances if he can get his king over and somehow win the bishop and the pawn for the rook, and then push his own pawn down the board. All right, king d5 for Magnus, king b7, king e6, king c8, king f7. Both sides doing a weird dance here, trying to maintain the opposition. Now, king d7 on the board, king g6, and king to e6. Now, king takes h5, wins the pawn on the h5 square. Now, Magnus Carlsen, he might have winning chances thanks to his h-pawn in this game. All right, king f5, defends the rook on g4 without having to move the rook. Now, king to h6, rook c4, king g7, and rook c6, blocking off the king on the 7th rank. Arjun doing his best to continue fighting in this game. Now king f7, rook c7, king to f8. The king is on the back rank, and Arjun Erigaisi, he is going for the checkmate. Here, king to e5, the threat now, if he can get his king over to f6, if that bishop moves, rook to c8 would be checkmate. That is the threat now. All right, king g8, rook d7, Arjun playing with his food. King to f8, and again, the king does not have access to f6 yet. Therefore, giving the checkmate is a problem. All right, rook c7, king g8, rook f7, bishop d8. Now rook b7, threatening rook to b8, pinning the bishop to the king. That would be game over. But instead, bishop g5 defends against the threat. Rook to a7, king f8, rook b7, king g8, and king to f5. Arjun, he cannot find a way yet. Now the threat is king to g6 and then rook b8. All right, Magnus, king f8. Both sides have seconds left on the clock. King g6, king e8. Now rook to f7. Arjun going for a different idea. King d8, rook to f5, king e7. And in this position, Arjun Erigaisi, he's had enough. He just trades off the rook for the bishop. Rook takes, pawn takes, then king takes. And here, both sides have to agree to a draw. There is no material left besides those kings on g5 and e7. Wow, what a game by Arjun Erigaisi and Magnus Carlsen at the 2024 Speed Chess Championships. All right, Chess YouTube, I hope you enjoyed this crazy game. If you did, go and smash that like button to support both Magnus and Arjun Erigaisi. Thank you so much for doing that. And while you're at it, check out this video right here where Magnus Carlsen sacrifices the queen against Arjun Erigaisi right out of the opening. If you haven't seen that game was a mind-blowing game. You have to check it out. It was just insane. You're going to love it. And I'll see you in the next video.